Hello, and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about a few things that I've read, and I hope you enjoy. We're going to start with an article titled Death by Civilization by Mary Annette Pember from The Atlantic, published March 8th, 2019. Let's get started. The reality of Native American boarding schools is a condemnation of this entire country. The existence of Native American people is a testament to the guilt and to the blood on the hands of the American Empire. Thus we get to the reason, the purpose of the myth of Native American extinction. Because that myth serves to protect those who committed one of the most brutal, bloody genocides and continue to commit genocide from due justice. Because, if they can say, well, they don't exist anymore, they were of the past, all those crimes were committed by people who are dead, and all the people who, the people didn't survive, and all, they didn't have children or whatever, they didn't pass down a legacy, they're extinct. These are issues in the past, and we just gotta get over it, maybe, spend a day thinking about it. There's nothing we could do. But what this article does is to say that this is a genocide that is in living memory. Survivors of this genocide are alive, and this genocide was real. My sources and your sources verify that this genocide did really happen and is continuing to happen. It's undeniable. And in finding this proof, we get an ironic sense of satisfaction. What the author does, verifying with state archival data the story that her grandmother told, we can have a spark of painful, ironic joy in knowing those who have committed genocide do know, in fact, that they have committed genocide despite their denial. And we can know that their denial is fraudulent. It's bittersweet. But when it's brought before those who are currently celebrating and prospering from the spoils of that genocide and of that crime, they refuse to take any accountability. And we learn that we are past the statute of limitations which they created for genocide. Now let's look at From the Achievement Gap to the Education Debt, Understanding Achievement in U.S. Schools by Gloria Ladson-Billings. This article and this concept of the education debt versus the concept of an achievement gap is a very powerful, very radical idea that I think gets to the root of social justice movements in all fields. This fundamental redefining of what the issue actually is. And thus, in the case of education, Black and brown students are not to blame for the system consistently failing them. To put the onus on Black and brown children is to further the injustices that they are facing that have created what in this society is an actual major problem. To call it an achievement gap is to misidentify the problem and to misidentify how and why we need to find solutions. The questions that we should be asking are not what do Black and brown communities need to do to support young people, but rather we should be looking at what is this costing us? What does it mean to leave behind a significant portion of our society along the lines of race? And when we realize the amount of damage that is doing to our national community, the answers become a lot clearer in what we actually need to do and what the issue actually is. And I think the issue is, as Ladson-Billings has so excellently put, that there is a debt, an unpaid debt to the Black and brown community and to Black and brown children in particular, and that this country needs to do everything it can to pay back that debt. And once that debt is paid, then we can begin to talk about how we move forward as a unified society. Continuing on, let's look at The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, Chapter 7, entitled Living Apart. This chapter explores the very real cost that white Americans pay for their self-segregation away from black and brown communities. This reframes the issue of segregation as not a problem for black and brown communities, but rather a problem for the most segregated community, that is the white community in America. They are the ones who are actively trying to self-segregate. It has always been the case that it has been white folks leading the march of segregation. The first thing McGhee does is point out that there is no difference between de jure segregation, that is legal segregation, segregation written into law, and de facto segregation, which we generally think of as just segregation by happenstance, like that, just how it happens to be. Because one, there's no difference in the result, and when we look at the systemic issues, find that there's no difference effectively. Except for de facto segregation, we have no legal grounds to stand on if we want to complain about it. Coming from a background of living in a majority white community, Port Orchard, Washington, as one of the few families of color, this chapter is kind of a no-brainer. Like the main thesis of this chapter doesn't take any convincing for me. Because I've seen it firsthand, and I absolutely agree. Just the logic of my life, white folks are the ones who want to be separate, and they have no idea what they're missing. Okay, moving on now to Critical Race Theory by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic, forward by Angela Harris. Critical race theory has been in the public discussion arena a lot recently. A lot of people don't seem to really know what it is. So it's more pertinent than ever to read the book. So what I like to look at critical race theory is asking the question, why do we need a critical race theory? I think it's because the recent history of racism in America has resisted critique. And the nature of colorblindness is to resist critique of racism and to resist critique in general and replace our critical thinking with platitudes and just charming racism, I think, as Trevor Noah coined it. Real charming, real subliminal racism, but also the dog whistle racism, where we don't actually need to say anything racist, but y'all know what we mean, So yeah, I think that's a good place to start here. Why we need critical race theory. Critical race theory attempts to make up for the failures of the civil rights movement, in that where the civil rights movement's so-called victories were very liberal and very, very much symbolic gestures, of things like desegregation and voting rights. Those victories, though they were victories in some respect, effectively changed nothing. Now that we look back on these events with the gift of hindsight, we know that these were largely symbolic gestures. And when we really look closely at it, we see issues like Brown v. Board to be mostly for the benefit of wealthy white individuals and for the benefit of white institutions, and to the detriment of the black people, which this case was supposed to be serving, which Brown v. Board very specifically was claimed to be serving. And critical race theory isn't to say that, doesn't say necessarily that the people who engineered Brown v. Board, those folks who were pushing for integration, meant to hurt black children in this process, but rather saying the intention is irrelevant. We can look at it again with the gift of hindsight and critically analyze the facts of the matter and see what the actual results of integration were. And from that analysis, we have a better understanding of how to move forward in the present day. So getting to the key tenets of CRT, we have interest convergence, otherwise known as material determinism, and racial realism. And then we also have revisionist history, and that is history that goes back and looks at history from a better lens, because the dominant white narratives of history are in desperate need of revision. And revision is not a bad thing in this case. I think revisionist history is something I see misinterpreted a lot as like rewriting of history, or just going through and erasing the reality of what happened in history. Critical race theory, revisionist history, is going through and giving much needed differing perspectives, much needed highlights on what were actually major historical events that were generally erased in our history lessons for one reason or another. And then the next tenet is the critique of liberalism, which, getting back to Brown v. Board, critiquing that symbolic gesture by analyzing the material results and what actually happened. And also, moving forward in the present day, the critique of liberalism makes us skeptical of the symbolic gestures that are being made towards the Black and brown communities today. That's an important thing, because we do have a largely performative political system. I mean, I think anybody who watches the news or tries to keep up with politics nowadays, it's pretty obvious how much of it is just performance. Even like, not as a critiquing the amount of performance that's within it, but it's pretty obvious to see that this is very performative. So the tenet of structural determinism says that racism, race, and all these other social constructs are just that. They're social constructs. They were created by people, and they're maintained by the systems that are created, again, by people, particularly people in power. So critical race theory, then, is just a solid foundation of which we can understand society from the view of race. And critical race theory now goes further than just looking at primarily black and white studies, but also critical race theory now serves as an umbrella term for a lot of other more specific critical race theories. But so understanding these things, we create a really good foundation to understand and move forward in creating a better society. So thank you for listening today, and enjoy the rest of your day.